So welcome. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you're at, however you're logging on, whenever you're logging on. Um, but today's short video is going to be questions about tenancy in common. On the screen, here, let me do this. On the screen, I have some questions about tenancy in common, but I do not want to go over those yet. So let me stop that share. But again, welcome to the short video. I am going to be discussing tenancy in common. So in real estate, there's all different types of things that are important, really important. But some of the nuances of property ownership are crucial to understand. They're very important to understand, especially when it comes to how a property is going to be handled when somebody dies or moves on. um, in the different types of ownership structures and different forms of co-ownership offer different rights and implication to the surviving owners when someone moves on or is deceased. And we have to understand for the test the key aspects that differentiate or distinguish the different types of ownership. In the video I posted about joint tenancy, there are certain things that you have to know about joint tenancy that makes them unique from the other types of ownership. So today we're going to be talking about tenancy in common and how the interest and that ownership structure is treated if someone wants to either get out of the tenancy in common or someone passes on. Does this ownership structure allow the tenant to pass their ownership on to other people that they may be related to or that they may assign to through a will or something like that? Or do the other tenants enjoy the right to be able to obtain that interest? And so before you buy a property or get into ownership group or whatever, you want to know how you're going to own that property. Tenancy in common is a structure in which it differentiates. So let's talk first about what tenancy in common is. Tenancy in common is where you have multiple people owning a property. They can have equal shares, they can have unequal shares. The big distinguishing feature about tenancy in common that is different from joint tenancy is that the right of survivorship. All right. What happens to a person's share or interest if they were to sell it, convey it, um, or were to die or move on without and what would happen to the property if someone was to again move on, want to sell their share, or want to convey their share or transfer their share somehow? Can they do that? And what happens with the tenancy in common? The big difference between tenancy in common, and this is really what's important for the test, is how you differentiate between tenancy in common and joint tenancy. That's really what the test is trying to make sure that you understand. Is how are they different? The difference is that in tenancy in common, you can have unequal shares, whereas in joint tenancy, you have to have equal shares. So that's a primary difference between those two. In tenancy in common, you can if someone were to move on or want to pass their interest on to heirs, they could do that. In joint tenancy, the surviving tenant or co-owner gets the interest of the other owner. So those are the main two things that they're going to try to test you about. There may be some other nuanced question that they may try to ask you, but ultimately they're trying to understand: do you know the difference between tenancy in common, and joint tenancy through the through how can you have equal shares, and do you have to have equal shares in tenancy in common? Can it be unequal shares? And then the most important thing is what happens to the ownership, the interest of an owner that moves on and wants to get out of the tenancy in common. So those are the things that they're going to try to test. And what I've done is I've gotten the multiple questions that we can go over and show you the different ways they're going to ask you about that, about these different things. So on the screen, I am going to share some questions with you here. Here are the questions. So the question number one right here. If an individual owning property with another person wants to share wants their share to pass on to their heirs rather than co-owners upon the death, which form of ownership should they choose? Again, if an individual owning property with another person wants their share to pass to their heirs rather than the co-owner upon death, which ownership structure should they choose? So if you know, I mean, if you know the definition of joint tenancy, then you should be able to answer this question. If you know the definition of tenancy in common, you should be able to answer this question. This is the structure that they definitely should pick in this instance is tenancy in common, because you know with joint tenancy, it does not pass on to their heirs. It's going to pass on to the surviving tenant in joint tenancy, or the surviving co-owner in joint tenancy. Um, and so they're directly, and this may be one, this is probably closer to a question that you'll see on the test. So the answer to this is joint, I mean, tenancy in common. And the thing that the part of the question that I picked out to know that, and I'm highly confident that this is tenancy in common, is the fact that they said want their share to pass on to their heirs rather than co-owners upon death. All right. In joint tenancy, that just can't happen. And if you know the definition of joint tenancy, you know that just can't happen in joint tenancy. The surviving co-owner gets that interest. Let's look at the next question. A buyer interested in purchasing a property that allows for the transfer of ownership without the consent of other owners. Which type of property ownership best fits this description? So now in this question, that's another one that probably will be, you'll get more like these two questions that I just went over on the test versus some of these other ones that we'll go over. This is a definite tenancy and common question. Let's read it again and unpack it. The buyer is interested in purchasing a property that allows for the transfer of ownership without the consent of the other owners. Well, here's the thing. In joint tenancy, you can't pass the share over to other owners. You have to get the consent of an owner in joint tenancy. But when you get that consent, then the joint tenancy is dissolved and it turns into a tenancy in common situation, because the four unities that is associated with joint tenancy. And here we know that this is tenancy in common because we don't need the permission of the or consent of the other owners to sell our share. Right? We can do that. We can assign it to our heirs. We can sell it without the consent of the other owners. So this is a very good question, and a more of a likely question that you'll see on the test. All right. The next question: What happens if a tenant in a common and what happens if a tenant in common wants to sell their interest in a property? Well, what happens is that they're allowed to. And they can sell their share in the property. Now, sometimes the other tenants in the tenancy in common may want to have like a first right of refusal, or they want to buy the share, or some of the tenants may want to buy the share. But ultimately, that tenant can buy their sell their share interest in the property. They can sell it to other tenants in the tenancy in common structure, or they can sell it to anyone who they want. And that's one of the benefits of entering into this type of ownership structure. Let's go to the next question. When managing a property owned as tenants in common, what is the best practice for handling repairs that benefit all tenants? So typically you're going to have each tenant say whatever percentage that they own, that's typically what they're going to contribute towards the repair. So if I own 25% of the entity, and say for instance there's three other people that own 25%, we will all share those expenses equally, but we would allocate the responsibility based on the proportion of the ownership that we have in the tenancy in common. Say, for instance, we had three people. One person had 10%, another person had 40%, and another person had 50%. That makes up the entire 100% of the ownership. Well, if we get a bill, then I'm responsible for 10% of that bill. The next person is responsible for 40% of that bill, and then the next person should be responsible for 50% of that bill. This is a question that you're less likely to see on the test. This is not really testing anything. This is more so testing well how the agreement between the people in the actual ownership structure is going to be handling repairs and things. So it's likely that you wouldn't get a question like this on the test. These two right here, you probably wouldn't get these two on the test. What happens to a tenant in common if a tenant in common wants to sell their interest in the property? That's likely that you won't get a question like that on the test. And then this other one, managing the property owned as tenants in common? What's the best practice for handling repairs that benefit all tenants? All right. Here's one. Here we go. Tenant A and tenant B both own the building as tenants in common, with tenant A holding 6% and 60% interest, and tenant A wants to renovate the property, but tenant B disagrees. What is tenant A's best course of action? So here, at this point, this is just a dispute between the tenants in common. So you have to really get together. And this question is definitely not one that's not likely to be on the test. But these are all different ways that they're going to try to ask you about about tenants in common and joint tenancy on the test. These are just questions that I pulled out of my bank of questions that I just wanted to go over with the class. But if this happens, then there has to be some sort of meeting of the minds between the two tenants, and they will have to discuss how they want to go ahead and renovate the property. There's not much that tenant B can do unless they just want to go ahead and renovate the property and maybe have tenant B pay them back in some way. But typically in this instance, they want to agree on any changes in terms of renovation to the property. And because it's going to benefit tenant A and B in terms of rehabilitating the property. But this is more likely that you wouldn't get a question like this. But I put it up there because these are some of the questions that we can go over. And we just want to think through this. So like if you really wanted to know like examples of this and like real life examples of this, sometimes I just take the question and put it right into the Google bar and it gives me a number of answers, a number of ways that you can, a number of ways to answer this question. Let's move to the next one. Define the meaning of tenancy in common. That's just pretty simple. And for the test, I definitely am going to know these two things. Tenancy in common, you can have unequal shares. And tenancy in common has no right of survivorship. You can pass on to your heirs or anyone else. You can convey your interest to anyone else without the permission of the other co-owners in that tenancy structure. So you got to know those two again. You can tenancy into common can be held in unequal shares, meaning that one person can own 10%, one person can own 25%, another person can own 15%, and then one other person can own 50%. They don't have to be equal shares. Each tenant can have their own percentage, and more importantly, there's no right of survivorship in this. If a tenant moves on, they have a right to pass it on to their heirs, their interest on to their heirs, or anybody that they feel fit. So those are the two biggest distinguishable factors in terms of tenancy in common. All right, the next question says, it says select the fact that correctly applies to tenant transfer interest and tenancy in common. It can happen. There's nothing that can stop it. Right. There's typically that you'll have an instance where some of the tenants may disagree with what you want to do with your interest, but if it's that important to them, perhaps they can try to have some agreement with the tenant that they buy that interest in a property and not sell it to someone outside of the ownership structure, that current ownership structure. This is a question that you likely wouldn't get on the test because that's fairly technical. And then the last question is a buyer is interested in the property or ownership is shared, but each owner has a specific undivided interest in the property, right? It says again, a buyer is interested in a property where the ownership is shared, but each owner has a specific undivided interest in the property. What type of ownership is this, right? And so this type of structure it could be this is more likely tenancy in common. It's an undivided interest, and so all of the tenants in tenancy in common have an undivided interest in the property. They have a specific share of the property. Say, for instance, they might have 10% in the property in terms of their share, but the interest is still undivided, meaning that they can't be excluded from using the property, or it's not like they can only use, if you only own 10% of the property, you can only use 10% of the property. No, you have an undivided interest in the property with a 10% share. So that's just a quick analysis of some of the questions that you're going to be looking at that you can look forward to and seeing on the test. Now, with the tenancy in common, these questions, the first and second question right here, are more likely ones that you're going to get. These other ones are pretty technical, but definitely know the definition of tenancy in common, and also know that there you can acquire or structure a tenancy in common where the members or the ownership entity has different unequal shares, and that the fact that there's no right of survivorship and that they can be passed on to the heirs. Those are the main distinctions between tenancy in common and joint tenancy. Thank you for joining me for this video. Hans Smith, Agent Success Training to Pass the Test.